Hello, everybody. Nice to see you. So we want to go into a big topic for this talk, for this time we're going to spend together. And the context, of course, for everything that I speak about is always enlightenment, or at least my consistently developing, consistently emerging understanding of enlightenment and what I'd like to call the right relationship to reality, the right relationship to being human. This is the big, challenging, and generally not fully answered question that most sincere spiritual inquirers and spiritual seekers sooner or later want to know. So the Enlightenment Experience, as most of you are already well aware, is very much about a profound awakening, a profound revelation, a profound recognition of absolute oneness, absolute unity, absolute perfection, unimaginable peace, unimaginable clarity, unimaginable joy. Unimaginable singularity, absolute singularity. One is all and all is one. And everything is so simple. When one is all and all is one, and you are and I and you are and we all are and I am that is one without a second, everything is so simple. There's nothing to think about, there's nothing to work out, there's nothing to understand, there's nothing to make sense of, because everything simply is as it is, because all is one and one is all. And that's the liberating truth for eternity forever. But relative reality, the context where everything is not absolutely real, but relatively real, is when the challenging, interesting, wonderful, amazing, beautiful, profound, mesmerizing world of difference begins to appear to us. When we descend from absolute reality to relative reality, we see that the absolute itself contains the relative. And in this recognition of relative reality, we discover that the one, without a second, is actually simultaneously and also the world of the many, the world of the world of complexity, the world of infinite differences. And so then we realize, if we continue our inward journey, that the one is the many and the many is the one. Now that we have awakened to the ultimate truth that there's only one and not two, how does our deeper consciousness and deeper cognition of that which is absolute, how does that inform our relationship with the world of that which is relative, or with relative reality? The question that the most sincere, serious, sensitive, thoughtful, intelligent people want to know is, what is the right relationship to reality? What's the right relationship to the experience of being human? Can you please tell me, is it possible to know, to find out, to understand what the right relationship to being a human being is, to being a conscious human being is? What's the right relationship to reality? Can you please tell me? So that's a very big question. It's a very difficult question. It's a very complex question. It's a very profound question. And it's a very important question. As a matter of fact, I can't imagine a more important question than, what's the right relationship to reality? And as I said, that's the question that the most sincere, authentic seekers and inquirers want to know the answer to, for a very good reason. And I continue to find that a big part of the spiritual life is working on that answer to that question. What is the most perfect and most appropriate relationship to relative reality, relative existence, to being a human being who lives in the world of time and space, cause and effect? And we have to make so many choices every single day. How do we make sense of all this? So what I wanted to do in this talk is use this basic context to look into our relationship to gender and to sexuality. What's the right relationship to being male, to masculinity? What's the right relationship to being a female, to femininity? What's the right relationship to apparently shifting experiences and notions of gender? What's the right relationship to our sexual feelings and our sexual identity? And how we enact those feelings and embrace them in the context of our, in the context of the complexity of our emerging humanity. So that's what I want to try and make sense out of with all of you tonight. Now, the whole notion of gender and sexuality is it's a very hot topic. It's a very difficult and charged area to go into. And I'm far from an expert on these matters. There's so much I don't know about sexuality, and so much I don't know about the complexity of gender politics and gender identity. I really don't know much about it. But what I do know about, what I am very familiar with, is what happens when we have made that shift from relative reality to absolute reality, and how deeply that impacts our relationship to being human, and how deeply that impacts the way we relate to the multidimensional complexity of being human. Now, our relationship to masculinity and femininity, and sexuality, gendered consciousness, is very dependent upon how conscious we are of the depth of what it means to be human and what it means to be a conscious human being. So in the Enlightenment context, in other words, in the context in which we give spiritual evolution and enlightenment our highest priority, in other words, that comes first. So whatever enlightenment is, whatever the greatest real, whatever that state of consciousness is that the greatest realizers have known, I choose to give the greatest priority in my life, and everything else in relationship to the human experience I put as a second, third, and fourth place. So that's the context in which I want to address this question. So if we put enlightenment first and not second, or third or fourth, if we always put it first, then we are pointing towards that shift from relative truth to absolute truth, from relative reality to absolute reality, from personal egoic identity to a transpersonal cosmic sense of self. And if we put that as a first priority, as a first value, then that's going to have a very big impact on our relationship to almost every aspect of being human, and in this case, very specifically, being male, being female, being any combination of both of those two, being gay or straight, and anything in between. Now, what happens when we make this shift from a relative identity to an absolute identity is that a great burden, a great existential burden on the small self gets lifted. Because the small self, our egoic identity, is very concerned with its past, how its past relates to its present, and how the past and present relate to the future. Is very absorbed in the personal narrative, the personal story of being oneself, and is obsessed with fears and desire, as the Buddha would say, fears and desires, hopes and dreams. Our personal identities tend to be more often than not a source of great pain and suffering. And a bad trip that we tend to want to get over sooner or later, God willing. So what the Enlightenment experience in its fullness, when it becomes full and deep and profound and all-encompassing and deep and real, it provides us with an opportunity, with a profound opportunity to let all that go. What a lot of us are trying to do with our personal egoic identity, including our relationship to gender, consciousness, and sexuality, and our sexual identity. Because we're usually trying to come to terms with all of it, trying to work it all out, trying to make the right choices. But the small self and the big self have a very different relationship to sexuality and to the consciousness of gender. So, as long as we're trying to work it all out, it becomes an emotional and psychological obsession for us, our neurosis, our pains and fears, our unresolved issues, our frustrations become an endless distraction. As I said, an emotional and psychological obsession and an endless distraction that creates in us an experience of self-consciousness, that is not free. Small s self-consciousness, the experience of small s self-consciousness is an experience of unfreedom. It's an experience of a very small, myopic, focused attention on the ego's drama, the ego's endless drama. And as long as we're trying to work it out and get over it or make it better, improve upon it, we're still trapped in the problem. But the Enlightenment revelation, the revelation of enlightened awareness provides us with an opportunity to ultimately, to ideally, to potentially, not that easy, doesn't happen that often, let go of the whole thing, to choose something bigger and more profound, more ultimately meaningful and purposeful, and liberating. So my point here is that when the ego, when your ego or when my ego, when the ego is invested in being a man, my ego is invested in maleness, or my ego is invested in femaleness, then the expression of my maleness or my masculinity or femaleness or femininity will express a measure of egoic distortion. Why? Because I'm egoically, consciously and unconsciously, for whatever reason, doesn't really matter why, invested in being male or being female, being gay, being straight, being trans, being whatever it is. I'm egoically invested in my less than absolute identity. So as long as we are egoically invested in in a personal identity, then is less than our absolute identity, this position will be expressed in self-consciousness, insecurity, fear, and doubt and attachment in relationship to being male, female, gay, straight, trans, and everything in between. It has nothing, what I'm saying inherently has nothing to do with being male or female. I'm not speaking about being male or female, gay, straight, or trans, or anything else. I'm speaking about our relationship to these distinctions. So conscious or unconscious egoic attachment and investment in a personal, less than fully realized non-relative absolute identity creates into differing degrees, into different measures, self-consciousness, small s self-consciousness in relationship to our relative identity. So when we make this profound shift from relative reality to absolute reality, from a relative identity to an absolute identity, we don't stop being human. When we make that shift from relative to absolute, we're still a human being. But what is the effect of that shift of identity if it's truly deep, truly radical, and truly outrageous and truly profound? What is the effect of that kind of shift on our human identity? If the shift is deep and profound and radical, the effect will be profound on our personality. Now, in the Eastern Dharma, often when they're speaking about enlightenment, they say enlightenment is the natural state. So natural means free from tension, free from self-consciousness. So what would our relationship be to being male, female, gay, straight, trans, or anything in between? If we were egoically completely uninvested in any of those distinctions, which may or may not be part of who we are. This is the question. What would it be like to be a man, to have a masculine identity, a masculine gendered consciousness, who wasn't particularly identified with being male, wasn't denying his maleness, his heterosexual feelings, was in no way in denial of any of it, was embracing it and embodying it, but was not egoically invested in being, in this case, a heterosexual male. Because sometimes we find that men who are heterosexual, who are a little excessively identified with their heterosexual instincts, feelings, and identity, when they express that identity, it often comically expresses itself as what it can often appear to be an over-exaggerated demonstration of a sexual identity and a sexual preference, which often seems very unnatural very self-conscious and so full of ego, on the opposite of natural. So the question I'm asking is, can we imagine what it would be like to be fully human, because we all are fully human, the complexity of our humanity, the complexity of the multidimensional nature of our humanity. How does it show up? How does it express itself? How does it show up and how does it express itself when we're not in denial of any aspect of who we are, when we're taking responsibility for the full dimensionality of what it means to be ourselves, while not being at the same time egoically invested in any particular aspect of our human identity, including the relatively arbitrary fact of our gender. And in the same way, the ultimately relatively arbitrary fact of our sexual nature, sexual identity, sexual preference. What if all of that is simply as it is, for whatever reason? What if all of that is simply as it is? Without a self-conscious egoic investment in that part of ourselves, in that part of our identity. It would then all the multidimensional complexity of human genderedness and sexuality could ideally be able to show up and express itself free from neurosis, free from self-consciousness, free from fear. So the idea here is, what does the natural state look like in relationship to some of these very nitty-gritty questions about the reality of being human, the complexity of the reality of being human, which doesn't go away with the awakening experience. We're still human beings. Human beings who've woken up, who are in the process of awakening, in the process of becoming more conscious. We're in the process of transcending the small self and embracing the nothing less than cosmic self-sense, which ultimately includes the whole cosmos. It doesn't deny the reality of this mind, this body, and this personality as being the locus for the experience. What if being a man was no longer, what if the relatively arbitrary fact of being male was no longer part of an ego trip, conscious or unconscious? What if being female, the relatively arbitrary fact of being female, was no longer part of an ego trip, or heterosexual or homosexual or any variety of sexual possibilities? What if none of it was any longer part of it, the ego trip of being me? It may be part of my relative identity, maybe a natural part of the expression of my humanity. But what if it was no longer part of the ego trip of being me? That's the question. Because in that case, because in the potential, in the developmental potential I'm pointing to, instead of trying to be a certain way, instead of trying to be a certain way, we from this position of liberated awareness, we almost get to find out what it's like to be a man or a woman, gay, straight, trans, and any other possibility. We get to find out without knowing beforehand what it's like to be a man or a woman, or any combination thereof, with any sexual preference, free from neurotic tension and anxiety and fear. We get to find out. And ideally, if these different aspects of the complexity of our emerging humanity would express themselves without any self-consciousness, fear, or tension, then we get to find out who I am as a man, as a woman, as a sexual being. But I'm not invested in any of it. And as I'm not invested in any of it, I'm not in denial of any of it either. It's fully accepting and embracing it without being egoically invested in any form of separateness. Even, I dare say, in any form of uniqueness. Even, I dare say, in any form of uniqueness. So then we get to express the complexity of the uniqueness of our particular humanness without being invested in it, egoically invested in it, in any kind of specialness. Without denying any of it, without resisting any of it, fully embracing all of it. There's room for all possibilities, but it's the egoic investment, and it's the conscious and unconscious egoic investment in difference and in the uniqueness of difference that creates so many problems for us as individuals and for us at a level of culture. Being invested in our uniqueness is such an existential burden. I'm not saying anything there's nothing wrong with being unique and with being special, because we all have so much to give. We all have so many gifts to give, and I believe, from the perspective of at least evolutionary enlightenment, that's why we're actually here. Once we wake up, we realize we're here to give our gifts. Otherwise, at the postmodern level of cultural development and beyond, without that revelation, there doesn't seem to be a big source of meaning in conscious existence as being human. So we're all here because we realize when we wake up that we have so much to give. And when we find out what our unique gifts are and we're able to give them, it suddenly makes absolute sense to be here. Whether it's easy or whether it's difficult, whether it's demanding or not. Suddenly makes perfect sense to exist, and that's the great gift. That's the liberation. That's the sense making from a spiritual perspective. But if we're invested in any notion of specialness or uniqueness, egoically invested in any notion of specialness or uniqueness, that's a problem from an enlightenment perspective. And ideally, we want to wake up so much so that our uniqueness and our specialness can be liberated. For too many of us, our gifts are trapped in the prison of our neurosis and our fear and our self-doubt. You know, we're incredible because we can make anything into an ego trip. Not only being male or being female or being gay or straight or trans or anything like that. We can use any notion of difference as a way to feel special. The ego will use any excuse to stand out and be special. And it's the most difficult thing to give up and to transcend, to want to try and be free of. To become empty of the need to be seen as being special for any reason, not just because of being male or female or gay or straight or anything else, but for any reason. That doesn't mean we're not special and unique. Doesn't mean we're not gifted. Doesn't mean we may not be a genius, an intellectual genius, a creative genius, an artistic genius, a literary genius. We may be one of all of those things, but from a spiritual point of view, from the perspective of enlightenment, what's important is that we're not invested in the uniqueness that is there. It's the attachment to uniqueness that keeps the self trapped in hell. So what I'm saying is very simple, but it's very profound and it's very radical, and the implications are all-encompassing when you really let it in. And paradoxically, what happens is the more we let go of the need to see ourselves as being special and unique for whatever reason, simultaneously we begin to recognize a great sense of personal power, spiritual strength, spiritual self-confidence begin to well up within us. Paradoxically, the more we let go of the need to see ourselves as being special, the more we become, relatively, from a relative point of view, truly special, powerful, full of spirit, the power of spirit and awakened intelligence. It's ironic and it's paradoxical and it's outrageous and it's all true. Not my will, but thy will be done. So let's not be so invested in our uniqueness and in our specialness. Let's not be so invested in our difference. Can we embrace fully, completely, responsibly, the fullness of all and the complexity of all our differences, and our uniqueness, not be attached to it, not be egoically identified with it? If we could, or if we can, then we would create a different world space together, I think. Free from conflict. The less focused on, less consciously or unconsciously, narcissistically focused on our uniqueness that we are, the more more room there is inside us to notice uniqueness of other people, of other beings. And we're less narcissistically, self-consciously, self-focused, and self-obsessed. There's a different kind of intersubjective experience is felt between us, between human beings. When narcissism and self-absorption is transcended by a few people, and when they come together and truly see each other, what arises is a mutual, is a much greater, from a place of much greater depth of mutual appreciation and recognition of the glory and the beauty and the ecstasy in the specialness of being human, being a self-conscious human being, in the best possible sense of what that means. This happens when we realize there's nothing between us. There's nothing between us, there's nothing that's keeping us separate anymore. When that happens, there's love and there's trust. And in love and trust is adoration of the other, naturally and spontaneously. And interestingly enough, we don't fall in love with each other's differences as much as we may appreciate those differences and respect them and honor them. But we fall in love with our non-difference. That's the source of the deepest human intimacy in my experience, is the falling in love with oneself, one's true self, in the face, heart, soul, and mind of the other. That's the greatest experience of intimacy, ecstatic human intimacy and non-duality. So the goal is natural and self-conscious, not polluted by ego. What would it be like to be you? What would it be like to be me? What would it be like to be us if we were in a natural state, free from self-consciousness, free from narcissistic self-distraction? So much becomes possible then.